John Garrity, the structural engineer, is going through a tough time in his marriage, and he hasn't been living at home for a while now. Despite the strained relationship between him and his wife Allison, the family comes together again to celebrate their little son Nathan's birthday. The boy is thrilled to see his father, but he's worried that after the party, he'll have to leave home again. He has diabetes and has to take insulin injections regularly. Meanwhile, the news is buzzing about the approaching interstellar comet Clark, which has been discovered recently. Surprisingly, this shocking news doesn't create panic among people, as it's assumed that the comet fragments will fall into the Atlantic Ocean near Bermuda. The next day, the whole family gets ready for the celebration. Allison sends her husband to the store for groceries, and he takes Nathan along. On the way, they notice military aircraft in the sky, which worries John. Suddenly, he receives an automated DHS alert on his phone. A robotic voice informs him that his family has been selected for emergency sheltering.
Standing by for more information. This is not a test.
Shocked, John rushes back home. Seeing a moving column of military vehicles, he realizes the threat is real. Guests have already gathered at home. Everyone is in a good mood and eagerly waiting for a live report on the comet's impact. John shares the message with Allison, but she assumes it's just a drill and doesn't give much importance to his words. Would you have believed the government and managed to stay calm, or would you have trusted your husband's concerns and evacuated? As everyone enjoys themselves, they start counting down as Comet Clark enters Earth's atmosphere. Despite the anticipation, the celestial body doesn't fall into the ocean as expected. Instead, there's an explosion somewhere in the distance. John steps outside to take a look, but the shockwave knocks him down and shatters all the windows in the house. In the news, a bewildered announcer reports that a fragment of the comet, the size of a football field, crashed into a neighboring city, wiping it off the map. Panic sets in among the audience. The situation worsens when a new government alert appears on the TV screen, urging John's family to immediately report to Robbins Air Force Base. A message with a QR code for entry is sent to John's phone. Guests scatter to their homes to check if they've received the same notification. In haste, John's family starts packing, trying not to forget anything important. Meanwhile, a massive mushroom cloud of fire rises outside, a testament to the horrifying devastation. They quickly get into their car, ready to leave, but frightened neighbors block their path. They hadn't received any alert. A family friend pleads for them to take her daughter to the base. Despite desperate pleas from Allison and Nathan to help the girl, John remains steadfast as they would be denied boarding and drives away. Share your opinion in the comments. Did the hero make the right choice in this situation? The family continues their journey to the evacuation flight, listening to the news in horror. According to forecasts, a large fragment of the comet will hit Earth in 48 hours, large enough to cause an extinction-level event. Approaching the military base, the travelers get stuck in a traffic jam that stretches for kilometers. Desperate people abandon their cars and run to the shelter on foot, and John's family follows suit. They struggle to make their way through the massive crowd at the entrance and finally make it onto the base. The military personnel provide each family member with special bracelets that will allow them to board a rescue plane. They are instructed that they can only bring one bag each, and the family hastily sorts through their belongings. Then, Allison realizes with horror that they left the insulin in the car. With only 15 minutes left before departure, John decides to go back to the car for his son's medicine. The worried Allison warns one of the soldiers that her husband went to get insulin and asks him to inform John which plane they will be put on. The soldier's face changes abruptly, and he demands that the mother and child follow him into an office. There, an employee informs Allison that there was a mistake and people with chronic illnesses are not eligible for evacuation. With horror in her eyes, Allison pleads for compassion, but the military personnel remain resolute. She explains that even her family won't be allowed to leave the danger zone on the plane. Her next words are even more terrifying. It turns out that all the military personnel on the base are volunteers who will have to face their end here after the comet's impact. Nevertheless, the woman makes a call to her subordinates and orders them to find John to warn him about the situation. He returns to the base, searching among the people for his family in confusion. Boarding begins, and John is forced to get on the plane, futilely trying to contact Allison. One of the passengers notices the insulin capsules in his hands and surprisingly informs him that people with illnesses aren't being allowed on board. John realizes that his family has been left at the base, and at the last moment, he rushes out of the plane. Outside, chaos erupts. Armed and desperate people who didn't receive clearance breach the barriers and attack the military. In the scuffle, a gasoline tank gets damaged, and John's evacuation plane explodes. Meanwhile, Allison and Nathan return to their car and discover that the medication isn't there. Without insulin, the boy's condition worsens, and his mother decides to immediately start searching for the medicine, not waiting for her husband. Later, John finds a note in the car that they are heading to her father's home in Lexington, Kentucky. His attempts to contact them fail, the network is too overloaded. On her way, Allison comes across a store that marauders have already looted. Despite the danger, they find the necessary insulin. Suddenly, armed robbers burst inside and open fire on those present. Amid the chaos, Allison and Nathan make their way past bodies and miraculously survive after a confrontation with one of the mobs. Outside, Allison notices a family in a car and persuades them to give her and Nathan a ride. Along the way, the couple explains that they are heading to another military base in an attempt to board an evacuation plane without a pass. Nathan accidentally lets slip that his father also got on a plane, and they weren't allowed to board because of his illness. Hearing this, the couple exchange meaningful glances. John roams the streets in search of his family and stumbles upon an end-of-the-world party. There, he briefly manages to catch a signal and calls Allison, but she couldn't tell him their whereabouts. Meanwhile, fragments from the sky continue to fall. John notices a small truck nearby and asks the driver to take him closer to the north. Inside the vehicle, John sees several people headed to Osgood, Ontario, Canada, and meets a guy named Colin. He notices the pass bracelet on John's wrist and shares information about the evacuation process. Colin says that people are being selected based on their professions. For example, his mother, being a doctor, was able to get her pass to the shelter. John, being a structural engineer, was likely chosen due to his profession, as it will be necessary to rebuild the destroyed cities after the apocalypse. Colin suggests that John accompany him to Canada, where there are pilots who will take them to the shelter.
The shelters are classified. How do they even know where they're going?
They've been tracking the military flights to Greenland.
John contemplates his offer but wants to locate his family first. He doesn't even realize that they are facing a significant danger at this moment. The driver, who is transporting Allison and Nathan, refuses to believe that they weren't allowed on board due to his illness. He is convinced that the boy will be their golden ticket onto the plane, and he decides to kidnap him. The man abruptly stops the car and forcefully throws Allison out. Meanwhile, in the truck with John, trouble also begins with one of the aggressive passengers. Threatening violence, he demands that John hand over his bracelet and documents, claiming that he's an immigrant and hasn't earned it. A fight breaks out between the passengers, causing the truck to lose control and overturn. After regaining consciousness, John is forced to continue the fight and manages to defeat his opponent. Afterwards, he looks around in shock and discovers Colin's lifeless body, who couldn't survive the brutal crash. John cries, realizing what he had to do to survive. Allison stands in despair in the middle of a busy highway, not knowing what to do next. Suddenly, a car stops near her, and a compassionate Mexican family offers her a ride. At first, she regards them with skepticism but decides to take the risk upon learning that they're headed towards a military airport. Meanwhile, the kidnappers of Nathan have already reached the base and instructed the boy to lie to the military, claiming that they're his parents. Tearfully, he disobeys them and tells the guards that he's been kidnapped. The imposters are immediately taken away by security, and the boy is sent to a camp. Allison's car gets stuck in traffic. She gets out and sets off on a search for her son. She desperately seeks help from the military, and they send her to a Red Cross camp. Together with a volunteer, they search through each tent, and finally, they find Nathan in one of them. Mother and son reunite with tears of joy in their eyes. A doctor enters the tent and informs Allison that they've replaced Nathan's insulin pump and prepared medical supplies for a week. She also helps them find a military bus that will be heading towards Allison's father's home in Kentucky. Meanwhile, exhausted from a sleepless night, John continues his journey through deserted streets. He decides to break into an abandoned house and, turning on the news, witnesses the grim picture of destruction and chaos that has engulfed the entire planet. And the millions of people didn't survive. Overcoming his emotions, he finds the keys to a car in the house and leaves a note promising to return the vehicle to its owners if he survives. In the car, he reaches his father-in-law Dale, who immediately starts berating John for losing his family. However, at that moment, Allison finally manages to call her father, and together with John, they pick her and Nathan up from a roadside store. The family is finally reunited and watches a news report in relative safety. It states that tomorrow the largest fragment of the comet will fall between Europe and Africa, marking the beginning of the apocalypse. Only those who have been placed in underground bunkers based on their professional skills will survive. The plot shows how well equipped one of the bunkers near Pitifix Space Base in Greenland is. Remembering Colin's words, John suggests that they act immediately and evacuate to Canada, from where they can fly to Greenland. He invites Dale to go with them, but he remains skeptical. It turns out that John cheated on Allison when they were going through difficult times due to their son's illness. John admits his guilt but assures his father-in-law that his family is his top priority.
I'm not expecting your forgiveness, Dale. If I get one thing right, I'm gonna get my son and my wife into that bunker.
Allison accidentally overhears their conversation and also asks her father to go with them. However, he remains steadfast in his decision, wishing to face the inevitable within the walls of the home where he spent happy years with his late wife. At that moment, another large fragment of the comet falls nearby, and the house shakes from the impact. There's no time to waste, and Dave hands his pickup truck and hunting rifle to his family. They bid their farewells, coming to terms with the fact that they'll never see each other again. On their way to Canada, they encounter a traffic jam caused by a train derailing and blocking the road. Almost immediately, an emergency alert announces a hail of incandescent comet debris set to fall right where they are at. In the next moment, molten debris hits, and John's family desperately seeks shelter. Leaving the pickup truck behind, they find refuge under a bridge. Noticing that some people are trapped in a burning car, John selflessly rushes to their aid. He manages to save them, but his hand gets severely burnt in the process. The family waits out the danger, and as night falls, they set out again. Upon reaching the airport in Canada, they are horrified to see that the plane has already taken off. However, John is not ready to give up. He drives the car directly onto the runway, where another plane is preparing for takeoff. Eventually, he manages to stop the aircraft, infuriating the pilot. At first, he refuses to let the family on board, fearing overload.
Then we're not moving! Alright, we're staying there, and you're not going anywhere!
Under John's pressure, he reluctantly gives in and allows them to board, on the condition that they leave their belongings behind. It seems like all the horror is finally behind them as the plane approaches the coast of Greenland at dawn. However, the passengers don't get to enjoy the beautiful sights as, in the next moment, a large meteorite fragment crashes into the island. It generates a powerful shockwave that almost destroys the plane in midair. Luckily, the aircraft remains airborne, but its engines are disabled. The pilots attempt to glide and simultaneously restart the engines. The co-pilot successfully restarts the right engine, but its thrust is insufficient, and the plane crashes a few kilometers away from the airbase. All passengers survive, except the pilots themselves. John coordinates the passengers' movements, and soldiers eventually find them. Carefully loading the survivors onto a truck, they head towards a bunker where safe refuge awaits. The largest fragments of the Clark Comet, which is approximately 15 kilometers wide, enter the atmosphere. Faced with the impending apocalypse, the military decides to save as many people as they can, abandoning the idea of admitting only the chosen few. Through a weather satellite, they're keeping an eye on the shockwave's movement from the fallen debris and see its tsunami wave towering over 300 meters. John embraces his family before the bunker is hit by the shockwave. His whole life flashes before his eyes, and he remembers how truly happy they were. 9 months have passed since the dreadful catastrophe. The ash hasn't completely cleared yet, but the surroundings show the world's complete devastation from the meteor impact. The Garrity's and other survivors exit the shelter to a drastically changed landscape, and Greenland makes contact with other stations around the globe. Unexpectedly, Allison hears birdsong, a sign that life still persists on the planet. In the story's finale, we see Earth, its surface pockmarked with thousands of meteoric craters of various diameters, and the outlines of continents change beyond recognition. That was the movie Greenland. Films about global catastrophes always terrify me. Nonetheless, I genuinely believe that the global community has a well-thought-out plan of action for such situations. Answering my earlier question, I would have acted similarly to John if the survival of my family were at stake. How would you face the challenge if you were in the shoes of the characters in this movie? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.